I want to do something a little differently tonight. I watched Joe Biden at Normandy, D-Day, giving a speech, and I was appalled. Obviously, he said some very important things, but his politicization of that event on the 80th anniversary, taking shots at Donald Trump, actually lying about what Donald Trump said, doing so in a very nasty way. And then I got to thinking to myself, there's a man standing at Normandy, D-Day, who when he's standing at Morgan State College in front of graduating black male students, or when he's standing at Howard, or when he's giving speeches generally, he's trashing the United States. He's talking about how our history is horrific, how we don't have equality of opportunity. In fact, I've never heard this man give an inspiring, patriotic, pro-American speech in his life. And that speech that he gave at D-Day, where D-Day occurred, that will never go down in history as a great speech. I went back and I listened to President Trump's speech on the 75th anniversary. It was searing. It was beautiful. It was patriotic. And so I went back and I listened to Reagan's speech. Same thing, a magnificent speech, a beautiful speech. Biden's not up to being president of the United States. It's even worse. He's not up to being a leader. He does not represent the values and the belief systems of the American people. He represents a fringe radical group. And then I got to thinking about Rashida Tlaib and Bernie Sanders and AOC and Omar and that whole ilk and what they say about the American people in our country. I got to think about the American media day in and day out with CRT and DEI, the Joy Reids of the world, the Jake Tappers of the world, and so forth and so on. It's so horrendous. The disconnect between the American media, most of it, the disconnect between academia, the disconnect between the Democrat Party, the president, their leadership, and we, the people of America, couldn't be bigger. I want to tell you a little story. When we were attacked in Pearl Harbor, 3 men that I know of went quickly to try and join the war effort to protect our country. One of them was my mother's father, my grandfather. His name was Maurice Rubin. He hated his name, so he called himself Mo. He was 34 years old, right at the limit. And he joined the Marines. And he fought at Guam. The Battle of Guam was a brutal battle. It went on from July 21st to August 10th, 1944. Almost 2,000 of our men were killed, over 6,000 wounded. But that wasn't the end of it. He was in the 5th Division of the Marines, and this is his platoon. You can see the men in this platoon. I think it was platoon 13, if I recall. And you can see him there. I want you to look at that picture. The vast majority of those men died on Iwo Jima. They never came home. I want you to look at them. Do they seem like they're privileged? No, they're not privileged. My grandfather was born dirt poor. His parents came over from Russia with nothing. Everything he had, he worked for. There was no welfare state. But he loved his country to the core. The Battle of Iwo Jima, 6,800 Americans died on that island, over 19,000 casualties. That battle went on from February 19 to March 26, 5 to 6 weeks, and look at the casualties. There were more Medal of Honor recipients as a result of that engagement, 27, than in any battle in American history. The 5th Marine Division. Of that division, there were other Marine divisions, almost 2,500 died, over 6,000 wounded. They sustained the heaviest losses. My grandfather was a patriot. When he came back from that war, his hand shook. He lost his voice. He spoke like this the rest of his life. I remember when I first met my grandfather, he was about 6'3", he was a big man. He'd been an amateur boxer. He was a tough guy. I remember him walking into our house. He wore a big Stetson, a long brown leather coat, and a Chihuahua in his pocket that he gave to the family, a Chihuahua puppy, as a gift. That's my first memory of him. He was no damn white supremacist. Period. He was a patriotic American. And in the latter years of his life, he lived them quietly. diabetes, and have his foot removed and so forth and so on. Our story is not unique. I want to tell you about another man in our family. By the way, his brother-in-law, that is his sister's husband, his name was Teddy. He joined the Marines the same day. He fought in the Solomon Islands, Guadalcanal. He was a big, tough man with big hands. That's what I remember. Two tremendous patriots. Tremendous patriots. And then there was my father. I'm telling you this for a reason, because American families all over this country have gone through this. American citizens who deserve respect by their government, who deserve respect by their president, rather than having their families attacked over and over and over again and lies told about them and the projection of racism on top of them. The racism that the Biden family practiced, the racism that Joe Biden practiced in the Senate, that had nothing to do with my father, my grandfather, my great-uncle, my family, nothing. That's on Biden. On July 4th, 1937, my father, Jack, then 12 years old, and a neighborhood buddy walked several miles from their homes to the parade route where the city of Philadelphia was celebrating our nation's founding. The route stretched from Center City, Philadelphia, not far from Independence Hall, to the Philadelphia Art Museum, which Sylvester Stallone would make famous in the Rocky movies nearly 40 years later. One of the dignitaries in the parade caught my father's attention, a Civil War veteran. He sat on the back of a four-door convertible, dressed in his old Union uniform, including his campaign hat. Behind him marched a small group of Spanish-American war veterans. But of all the soldiers, veterans, and marching bands my father saw that day, the Union soldier stood out. Young Jack had read somewhat about the Civil War in school, but seeing the soldier in the flesh intrigued him. The soldier would become seared in my father's mind. The most costly war in American history had become real to him. Thus began my father's lifelong journey of self-education and patriotic preaching about this great nation's history and founding principles. At a young age, Jack had a knack for drawing, designing, and inventing, and when he was 13, he designed an automobile window, an invention for a contest the Philadelphia Daily News was conducting in conjunction with the release of the movie Young Tom Edison, starring Mickey Rooney. Remember that little sort of triangle window? Well, among others, that was his idea. He was one of only 5 winners citywide and earned a trip to the 1939 New York World's Fair. This had an incredible impression on him. At 15, my father submitted an idea with drawings for animating the story A Christmas Carol to the Walt Disney Studio in California. The studio loved it and asked that he provide more examples of his work, including humorous cartoon drawings, which he did. They next contacted Jack's parents and asked whether they would allow their son to join Disney Studios. Well, they said they would provide him with dormitory space and schooling at their facility while he was working for them, but his parents, concerned about his age, turned down the offer. My father grew up during the Great Depression. His family was very, very poor. His father, Harry, worked at part-time jobs when he could find them. His mother, Sarah, worked in a cigar factory about a mile down from where they were living. Jack was the eldest of 4 children and the only boy, and when he turned 16, after the school day ended, he would walk to the cigar factory down the street where he worked until midnight, earning the going rate of $17 a week. On weekends, my father took freelance jobs with furniture frame manufacturers, sketching frames to upholster sofas and chairs. He was paid $2 for a set of drawings. The manufacturer's salesmen used the finished drawings with their customers. A few months later, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. Jack spent the summer working at the Cramps shipyard, the Philadelphia shipyard, where they built destroyers and submarines. But he wanted to do more for the war effort. And like so many wonderful young men at that time, my father decided to enlist in the armed forces. He wanted to be a cadet in the Army Air Corps, which today we know as the Air Force. But Jack was only 17. He was too young. So he secured a copy of his birth certificate from City Hall, rubbed out the number 5 in 1925, his birth year, and wrote in 4. And just like that, he reached the legal age requirement of 18. Now, if he could pass the rigorous Air Corps exam, he was in. 10 would-be cadets took the exam, including students from the University of Pennsylvania, but only 4 passed, including my father. Not long thereafter, as my father was boarding a train to Biloxi, Mississippi for basic training, a soldier stopped him and told him the lieutenant wanted to see him. The lieutenant, who had taken a close look at the birth certificate, asked Jack how old he was. Well, Jack told him the truth. The lieutenant wasn't very happy, but he told my father when he turned 18, he could join up. A week after, he turned 18, and he did. And while in the service, Jack would use brief respites to draw cartoons, which were published in a variety of newspapers. He would later join the regular army in the infantry, and it always bothered him. They never sent him overseas. And when he was on his deathbed, he called me over about 5.5 years ago. It was just he and I in the hospital room. His body was racked with cancer. He said, "You know, Mark, I know why God didn't send me to Europe." I said, "Why, Dad?" "So I could have you. Your mother and I could have you." My parents were great people. And as he was dying, he was trying to write another book on the Declaration of Independence. He wrote several books: the Gettysburg Address, Lincoln's Second Inaugural Address. It was all aimed at children. It influenced the younger people. This is what he drew shortly before he passed away. The current President of the United States, his Secretary of State, his National Security Advisor, the Press Secretary for the President, the Press Secretary for the Secretary of State keep saying when it comes to Israel, there is no victory. What do they mean by victory? My grandfather knew what victory meant. My great-uncle knew what victory meant. My father knew what victory meant, and we know what victory means. And when I listened to Donald Trump's speech and him reference the concentration camps, and when I listened to Ronald Reagan's speech and he referenced the 6 million Jews have been slaughtered, when I listened to Joe Biden's speech, he never mentioned Israel, not once. Talked about Trump without naming him. He talked about Ukraine, and I agree with him on Ukraine. But he's the one that's held back Ukraine despite all the money spent. They haven't gotten the armaments that they need to actually defeat some of these Russian battalions. And he's withheld. They're okay for them to attack beyond a certain level. The Europeans have been begging him. And he talks about democracy. When he's in front of other groups, he talks about his hate for America. You know who else knew about victory? Dwight Eisenhower and Harry Truman. They knew something about victory. After close to 5 years of fighting the Nazis in Europe, General Dwight Eisenhower issued the Order of the Day on June 6, 1944, D-Day, that said in part, "The tide has turned, the free men of the world are marching together to victory. I have full confidence in your courage, devotion to duty, and skill in battle. We will accept nothing less than victory." Almost a year after D-Day, President Harry Truman announced victory in Europe, VE Day, on May 8, 1945, in which he said, in part, "For this victory, we join in offering our thanks to the providence which has guided and sustained us through the dark days of adversity. Our rejoicing is sobered and subdued by a supreme consciousness of the terrible price we have paid to rid the world of Hitler and his evil band. If I could give you a simple watchword for the coming months, that word is work, work, and more work. We must work to finish the war. Our victory is only half over. Much remains to be done. The victory won in the West must now be won in the East. For the triumph of spirit and of arms, which we have won, and for its promise to peoples everywhere who join us in the love of freedom, it is fitting that we as a nation give thanks to Almighty God, who has strengthened us and given us the victory. I call upon the people of the United States, whatever their faith, to unite in offering joyful thanks to God for the victory we have won, and to pray that he will support us to the end of our present struggle and guide us into the way of peace. I also call upon my countrymen to dedicate this day of prayer to the memory of those who have given their lives to make possible our victory. I send also my personal appreciation of the superb leadership shown by you and your commanders in directing the valiant legions of our own country and of our allies to this historic victory. Every president has known what a victory means, perhaps other than Obama and Biden. The reason there isn't victory in Israel right now is because Biden is funding the enemy and he's preventing Israel from winning. What is victory, they ask. The reason the Ukrainians are now on their heels isn't because of lack of money and arms. It's because Biden has held them back. Well, he's talking about Russia. And he used that D-Day speech to lie about your political opponent in front of the world, where all those brave men are buried. At that solemn place on that solemn day is disgusting.
Click here to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page to catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You won't get it anywhere else.